Hello, AP World History students. Thank you for waiting through the delay. Let's go ahead and get started with this AP World History Review. I'm going to make sure that we're popping up here on our Hangout live review session, whatever you want to call it. And we will go ahead and start. Some of you already put in some questions. So we'll start with those, and we will do our best to move quickly today, looking at time period 6, answering all your questions. If you've been working on your review packets, probably mostly on your own until the videos are put up today. If you've been working on those, you might have some questions, and I'll be happy to go over those so you don't have to pick through your reviews today. Little Zuckerberg sip of water right there. The review videos that I put up for tonight, Key Concept 6.1, it's pretty straightforward, about 19 minutes, 6.3 about 19 minutes, and 6.2, as I kind of warned you in class, is a beast, kind of like Key Concept 5.3. So it runs a little over 40 minutes. Break that into 2 sessions. Do not try to do it all at once. Most of it is dealing with World Wars I and II and the Cold War. Probably the most important part of it are the discussions on decolonization. You'll know the rest, I think, pretty well. But if you have questions about that, I will try my best to answer them tonight. We are in my office / guest room / Notre Dame shrine. So welcome to my home. We're going to get started with the questions. There's about 15 of us right here, so get your questions in soon in case others pile in. But given the fact that I didn't send the link out till very late, that, it may not happen. Whatever. First question of the night goes to Asher, who also reminded me that I had not sent out the link. So thanks, Asher. And the question is, how much do we need to know about the Biafra? Well, it depends what time period you're asking about, but in time period 6, we look at the Biafra as an example of a secessionist movement, an example of sectionalism that develops and conflicts that develop due to inherited imperial boundaries or former imperial boundaries. So when we think about the Biafra, which is this bight in Africa, kind of that curved area in West Africa down to Central Africa. The Biafra, historically, there had been a state there, and it had been quite strong. We looked at it with like the arrival of the Portuguese and the state of Biafra. But it was part of, in this time period, the colony of Nigeria, which becomes or the British colony, which becomes Nigeria. And within that region, this African country of Nigeria, the most populous country on the continent of Africa, there had been a group of people, the Igbos, which is an ethnic group. It's a Christian ethnic group located in the southern oil-rich parts of Nigeria. They were very westernized due to British imperialism, and they were not happy with the fact that the government of Nigeria was becoming increasingly dominated by northern groups. Now, if you know anything about like the makeup of Nigeria, the coastal regions tend to be more Christian. That makes sense because Europeans had more interactions on the coast, and the inland regions tended to be Muslim. Of course, that makes sense, what we know with West Africa. And the Igbo people in this southern region of Nigeria sought more autonomy, and they even wanted to secede. And so they fight this civil war. It's called the Biafran Civil War, where this Biafra movement gets its name, or gives its name to the Civil War, whichever it is. You get the point. To secede. They end up losing, actually, in this war, but there are some changes made in Nigeria to try to respond to some of these ethnic conflicts, ethnic differences within the state. Overall, it is an example of a secessionist movement or a regional movement. Sorry if I'm not making a lot of noise with these papers. I've got your review pack in front of me just to make sure that I cover everything tonight. Other examples of this dealing with inherited boundaries, we see the Quebecois movement, the Quebec we talked about in class briefly, and then one that's happens kind of concurrent with independence, which is the separation of India and Pakistan. All right, that's all you need to know about that. Next question: what incidences are a must-know regarding the 21st century? Good question, because I'll be honest, we don't cover much of the 21st century in this class. There's enough of the 20th century to go around, and then we kind of cram it all in at the end or in a video like this. So when I think about what are the must-knows regarding the 21st century, I think about, well, I guess what was important in my own life on kind of a global perspective. When the year 2000 comes about, we literally are like in the middle of this like technology revolution, right? That begins in the 90s and continues even today. But on kind of an international politics scale, the biggest event is in 2001, September 11th, 2001. The United States is attacked by terrorists who are organized by the Al-Qaeda terrorist group, who's also mentioned in your key concepts as an example of a group that, let me get the terms exactly right here. I don't want to misspeak when I bring these up. It is an example of, oh, where'd it go? Oh, movements that used violence to achieve political aims. That's the exact phrasing, but Al-Qaeda terrorist group, of course. And so as a result of these attacks on the United States, of course, there are a myriad of changes socially that take place in the United States. Politically, there are certain changes to kind of even like we accept like restricted freedoms in terms of like going to the airport in order to kind of protect our safety. But what spins off of this attack is the United States making war against Afghanistan. And the reason why we picked Afghanistan was not arbitrary. The Taliban government in Afghanistan had been giving safe harbor to the Al-Qaeda higher ups, especially Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of that organization at the time, killed much later under the Obama presidency. So the United States starts a war against Afghanistan, and then through what has turned out to be, by all measures, incorrect intelligence, the United States believed that Iraq had also been supplying these people and had weapons of mass destruction. And so we began a war in Iraq as well in 2003. So the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, I would say, are also very significant 21st century events. Outside of that, I would also throw in the Arab Spring, which started in 2010. I want to say it seems like it has not been that long. But it was going on, I remember, while I was in my third year teaching. So it must have been 2010, where we see young people begin to organize for democratic reforms in Tunisia first, in what's called the Jasmine Revolution. And those revolutions spread across Northern Africa and into the Middle East. It leads to regime change in Libya, in Egypt. It leads to a civil war, which continues to this day in Syria. And these revolutions were across the Middle East and have created uncertainty for the future of the Middle East. But what was certain is that the young people of the Middle East were looking for more democratic reforms. Of course, what also comes with that is opportunities and instability for more fundamentalist governments or fundamentalist groups to try to seize power as well. We saw that in Egypt with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, a religious movement that also tried to kind of redefine the role of individual and state. So those, I think, are the ones that really stand out most in my mind, and I think might be something that could show up on the AP exam, certainly September 11th. But then just like the general process of globalization that has continued into the 21st century. We can think about the continuance of like pushing for free trade and free trade agreements, right? So like even if we think about like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States was going to join, but then both candidates, Clinton and Trump, turned against it and said, no, this isn't something we want. Pacific countries still kind of have gone ahead with that because of the importance of free trade to their economies. And now the United States may be re-entering it. So, there's a lot there. There's a bunch, but September 11th and its aftermath, the Arab Spring, I'd say, are the most important. Question: where can we find the other 2 period 6 videos? Take a look at my either Twitter account, which has the links, or my YouTube channel. Oh, I just dropped something. My YouTube channel, they were posted today, so you'll find them. Again, don't watch that section 2 and all the way through. In fact, if you're trying to get it in before the test tomorrow, I think Key Concept 6.3 might be more helpful. You'll probably know most 6.2. We spend most of our time in class on that. I'll post those to the PLP hopefully tonight, but no promises. Next question. There were references to some kind of reading on the independence of Vietnam linked in the PLP, but couldn't find any segments on it in the readings. Could you go over it briefly? I think I linked to it. I want to say, I have to look back. It's in there, I think, with the reading about Pol Pot in Cambodia, I think. I don't have this. I have a version of that review book here, but I don't have it in its entirety. So I can't say for sure. It may be linked when you had the reading on like developments in the Iron Curtain countries. But generally, if you're just asking about Vietnam or about the independence of Vietnam, it is French Indochina, the French colony, is taken over by Japan during World War II. And after the war, France tries to reassert its dominance over that region. And oh yeah, so it is. Sorry, I just found it. It's on. Well, it's not on the same page in your book, but post-colonial struggles in Southeast Asia should be connected to the reading on Cambodia you had on our Cold War dinner party. But anyways, France tries to reestablish control, but Vietnamese communists under Ho Chi Minh, the nationalist communist leader of Vietnam, proclaim the country's independence, and they spark a war that is fought against France that lasts until 1954. The peace treaty between France and Vietnam split the nation of Vietnam into 2 regions, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And when the North attempted to invade and take over the South, that's when the United States steps in with its role in the Vietnam War, first by sending the advisors under Eisenhower, then expanding them under Kennedy, and then sending troops under Kennedy and or under Lyndon Johnson, and then full out U.S. involvement in the war. But what do you need to know generally, I would say, about that independence? That Ho Chi Minh leads the communists against the French attempt to re-establish control over Vietnam. And they are successful in 1954, but conflict between communist and non-communist forces especially the forces in the South under DM, who was propped up by the United States until basically the publicity of how much violence he was carrying out in the country became widespread. And part of that is through well, probably too much to get into right now, but part of that was the self-immolation of a Buddhist monk. The United States had to formally basically say, we don't support DM anymore. And there was a coup to remove him from power. If it sounds complicated, it certainly is. I don't think you're going to need to know all the ins and outs of that for the AP exam, but again, Ho Chi Minh leading the forces of Vietnam against the French and then later against the United States is an example of that anti-imperialist, nationalist, communist movement. So that's a long answer to your short question. What are the results, the next question, of Egypt's decolonization? So that's a good question. One of the things that we see in Egypt that is particularly of note is the rise of the leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. And Nasser is one of the most fascinating figures of Middle Eastern history, to me anyways, certainly one of the most fascinating figures of world history in the 20th century. But Nasser basically rises through the ranks. In 1952, he overthrows the king of Egypt and establishes the Republic of Egypt, but he basically rules it. Well, he takes over with another guy, but Nasser becomes the second leader. Whatever, that's all you need to know, really. And Nasser was a proponent of pan-Arabism. That is, he wanted to promote the cultural unity of Arab nations. And his policies were such that he basically made a pretty big name for himself. For example, he nationalized the Suez Canal along with other commercial enterprises, foreign banks he nationalizes. He makes some socialist reforms, but nationalizing the Suez Canal leads to a major crisis in the world. Basically, France and Britain hatch a plan, because they had been in control of this canal. They hatch a plan to work with Israel, basically have Israel seize the canal zone, and then they would paratroop in and take it over to secure it so that it wasn't a source of conflict. This actually ended up being like a major embarrassment for Britain and France. The United States and Soviet Union kind of come together on this in support of Nasser and tell Britain and France to back down. It's very clear at that point that Britain and France are no longer kind of the major powers in the world. The U.S. and Soviet Union have taken that role, but that becomes known as the Suez Crisis. But Nasser rules Egypt until about 1970, and then his successor is a guy named Anwar Sadat, who is noteworthy for his negotiations with the Israelis. Basically, Sadat and the Israeli prime minister meet with President Jimmy Carter at Camp David, and they signed the Camp David Accords, in which Israel gives Egypt back the Sinai, which they had seized in the Six-Day War. And in response, Egypt recognizes the right of the country of Israel to exist. And those agreements still stand to this day. Pretty remarkable treaty. Of course, one of the results of that is that Israel and Egypt, at least last numbers I saw, were the top two recipients of aid from the United States in the world. Now that may be surpassed now by Iraq or Afghanistan, but they were very high up there on the amount, on how much aid we give. And of course, that was the U.S.'s kind of deal. We're already a big supporter of Israel, but the amount of aid we sent to Egypt basically was up there as well. Sadat is in 1981 assassinated, actually, as the leader of Egypt, and a man named Hosni Mubarak takes over, and he actually ruled Egypt until the Arab Spring that I just talked about. So he was ruler of Egypt for about 30 years before he was removed from power. All right. Again, another long answer to a short question. I just didn't get to talk about that in class this year. So what do you have to know about the independence of French West Africa? So the main thing I think to know about the independence of French West Africa is that it gained its independence through negotiation mainly. There is kind of like this, I want to say like a French kind of Commonwealth of Nations. I don't know if that's what you'd call it, that develops. Guinea, though, refuses to join, but several other countries end up being created out of this region. The names of those countries are Guinea, Mauritania, Senegal, Niger, Benin. I think Burkina Faso's in there. I'm probably missing others, but that's the what we see with French West Africa. Examples of colonies negotiating for their independence during this era of decolonization. Why the change from your kitchen? Oh, well, that's because I needed a change and my computer was set up here. So I hope that doesn't offend anyone. And this is, as if you joined us early, this is my Notre Dame shrine room slash office slash guest room. So not my bedroom. What are the most necessary people to know from China? Kind of confused where Deng Xiaoping fits in. Oh, well, I'm guessing you're thinking period 6 here. So if you're thinking about period 6, most important people in China would certainly have to be our nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, our communist leader, Mao Zedong, and Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping takes over in the late 70s or early 80s, I want to say. I know I can find that date shortly if you give me a moment. But Deng Xiaoping is the one who makes some reforms in China, kind of rolling back some of the Maoist reforms or Maoist actions, sort of like we see with Khrushchev and Stalinist Russia. And then he implements some free market policies in China to spur on the Chinese economy, which has kind of continued to be the policy of the Chinese government and quite successful. I was going to see if I missed anything else. So reforms under Deng Xiaoping, DengXiaoping. His reforms include replacing communes that were set up in the collectivization programs of Mao with peasant leased plots of land where peasants could grow their own crops and sell portions of them at market, which led to agricultural surpluses. Factories also could produce more consumer products, and foreign companies were able to set up factories in special economic zones in coastal areas of China, which still continues to be the case. Although there were still political reforms, things of freedom of speech, what people maybe expected under Deng Xiaoping, but after the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, the government cracks down on that, and those do not come. We still see government suppression. What was important in Latin America during this time period prior to communist revolutions and all that? So you actually have a reading on this. So I'm going to direct you to the reading because I don't want to read it to you. And the reading was specifically looking at the end of kind of this economic imperialism that we see in Latin America. It was under modern Mexican culture and politics, which looked at kind kind of modern Mexico and other political trends in Latin America. If you're thinking about, you may be asking a question about like the Mexican Revolution. If that's what you're talking about, I can go over that. And generally, what we see in the Mexican Revolution is a movement to more support peasants in what ends up being kind of an era of bad things. I don't know the exact word to say there or put or to think about that might fit that. In Mexico, basically in the 20th century, the country was under the control of a dictatorship. Basically, there was this guy named Diaz, and he had control of most of the country's resources. Also, there was a lot of foreign investors, a lot of economic imperialism, we might want to call it, from the United States and Britain. And peasants had almost no land. In fact, 97% of the land was controlled by the wealthiest 1% of the population. That sounds sort of familiar about how where the world's heading. Then, draw your own conclusions. But there was a revolution that breaks out in 1910, insurrections in northern Mexico. When this guy Francisco Madero gets arrested, and basically Madero escapes and he sets up revolution. In 1911, his troops under the command of a guy named Pancho Villa, who you may have heard of before, defeats Mexican troops. They send Diaz into exile. But there are kind of a series of leaders and governments that come after that in the revolution. One leader, a guy named Emiliano Zapata, he gives voice to some of like the lower classes, some of the peasants who were not happy with the distribution of land. And so there were additional kind of uprisings and insurrections surrounding the need for land redistribution. There was a lot of stuff promised. There was a promise of land redistribution. There was a promise of better education. There were promises of like granting the right to vote to more people. And they kind of took a long time to come about. There was a constitution written, but it's not until like the 1930s that we actually see those reforms. And I mentioned that in the video, in one of the videos I made earlier. But a guy named Lazaro Cardenas takes over, and he actually starts making some of those land reforms in the 1930s. He also nationalizes industries, including the oil industry. You can imagine that would like anger a lot of like American owners of oil fields or British owners of oil fields. What does that mean for Mexico? Well, there are some reforms that eventually come out of this, but ultimately, the status quo basically remains. The rich remain rich. The peasantry remains lower class overall. And then later on, you have the reading for kind of the rest of it, looking at Mexico basically from the 60s up to today. I think that's what your question meant, but I feel like I'm going overboard on all these questions, so apologies if that's happening. I'm trying to do the best on that. All right. What do you need to know about Bangladesh? That it used to be known as East Pakistan until it gained its independence in 1971. Basically, if you think about India, and I'm like mirrored here, so I have to think about how you're viewing India here. So you have India kind of here, and here in the northwestern part of India is a very heavily Muslim population, and that will become Pakistan. But also over here in the northeast of India, there is another heavily Muslim population, and that is what is now Bangladesh. They were, at the time of the partition of India and Pakistan, Bangladesh was known as East Pakistan. It was part of that singular nation. But you can imagine how difficult it is to have a single nation when it's located in 2 regions. Also, when the capital is located in what is now present-day Pakistan. So those people in East Pakistan certainly are not very happy about that. And eventually they push for their independence in their own independent state, and that is Bangladesh. There you go. Important things to know about the Iranian Revolution. This is one of my biggest disappointments of not really teaching, not having time to give my lecture on the Iranian Revolution in class. So stay with me and I'll try to recap it very quickly. Iran has been kind of a region that was had fallen under foreign domination for like most of the 19th century. Okay, so whether it was like Britain, or whether it was Russia trying to gain control of some of the region, maybe the Ottomans, or eventually Britain in the early 20th century, they had basically fought over this region. And of course, when oil is discovered in Iran, well, then that area becomes so much more important to these countries. Ultimately, though, in 1921, the power is seized by a guy named Reza Khan, who declares himself Shah. So, which is basically a king. He declared himself to be the king. And he modernizes the country's infrastructure. He ends extraterritoriality, basically taking control of the country. He even curbs the power of kind of Islamic leaders in the country, but ultimately is viewed by nationalists as kind of a puppet for Western nations. The Shah actually like works with the United States and actually gets in trouble because he asks the CIA to help him get rid of his prime minister at some point, and the US helps with that. And so there is a big pushback against the Shah. He even like makes some progressive reforms, but he's still kind of pushed out. And in 1979, a revolution takes place, predominantly of conservative Islamic fundamentalists, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And this revolution basically kicks out the Shah. He's forced to leave Iran in 1979. Americans are taken hostage, and this leads to the Iranian hostage crisis, which arguably is one of the reasons why Jimmy Carter loses the election in 1980, or at least loses it as bad as he does. And this cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, basically a Shia cleric, becomes the supreme leader of this new Iran, which made sure that all laws complied with Islamic Sharia law. And what's interesting is that we see Iran, which had been like a very Western country, then a country where women dress more like people in New York than people in what we would consider to be like a traditional conservative Muslim country. We see that those reforms basically kind of rolled back very quickly in Iran. A really good recap of this, and I think would probably be able to find it on YouTube, is the beginning of the movie Persepolis, which is based on the graphic autobiography of I can't remember her name exactly, but it's oh shoot, I'm gonna look it up. Satrapi is her last name. It's written by Marjane Satrapi. And you hear the term satrap there. We could review for the early Persian Empire to talk about what satraps are, anyways. But if you look up YouTube, like the beginning of that, it gives a really nice recap of the Shah's rise to power, albeit certainly one with a very particular point of view, and talks about the beginning of this revolution, anyways. So that's Iran as quickly as I can and give it. All right. I think I got everything. Oh gosh. A lot of banter back and forth. If you're a ninth grader watching this, it's not for you. Can I go over the major African leaders during this time period? I can. I would say that in general, you need to know, let me think about it. Let's go kind of starting in the north. You need to know Nasser and Sadat from the Egyptian or from the country of Egypt. Like, all right, that's a start. I would also throw in there that Muammar Gaddafi might pop up, the leader of Libya, who was also removed from power in the Arab Spring. Longtime dictator, supporter of terrorism, including like hijackings of airplanes. Who else is mentioned? I'm trying to think of other people mentioned in the key concepts. Jomo Kenyatta, leader of Kenya, Pan-African supporter, leader of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, and Nelson Mandela, leader of South Africa, first Black president of South Africa, leader of the African National Congress and the anti-apartheid movement in that country. There's probably one or two more, but those are the ones off the top of my head. All right. Any other questions? What would you say are the phases of period 6? Is in World War I, interwar depression, World War II, beginning of the Cold War, etc. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. A good start there. The phases of period 6, you have kind of the build up to World War I, which is really kind of the end of what we call the long 19th century. Everything really from the French Revolution to World War I is kind of on this like trajectory for this great war. But you have that build up to World War I and World War I itself. The interwar period is significant because of, the cultural changes that are taking place in Europe, what we call the crisis of modernity. The depression hits, the rise of totalitarian governments, all sorts of I don't know how else to say it other than craziness. World War II is another phase. But concurrent with the Cold War, we have that era of decolonization. So I would add that to your list. And then I would say we have the post-Cold War era as well. And really kind of concurrent with the Cold War and decolonization and that post-Cold War era, we're seeing increasing levels of global integration. That's what I would say if I'm thinking about, making a timeline of big eras. I would have that increasing, global integration really, really ratcheting up from the end of World War II. Daniel asks, is there a definite end time of this time period, like a specific date? To the present, sir. So I would say that date would be May 17th, 2018. But realistically, you are most likely not going to see anything since the test went to print. So I don't know when that happened, maybe last month. I would be shocked if you saw anything from the Syrian civil war. I would not be as shocked if you saw something from the Arab Spring in 2010. But the odds are, if you're seeing anything after 9/11, then it is most likely going to be a modern example of a trend that we've seen somewhere in history. So you might see, for example, a excerpt from some kind of writing of a terrorist group, right? Maybe it's something from ISIS, or maybe it's something from Al Qaeda or Boko Haram, or any of these groups, and you might have to connect that to whatever the theme is. Maybe it's the use of violence to achieve an end, or achieve some type of goal against a state, or perhaps it's a push for democratic reform, or maybe a desire to counter Westernization, right? So it's something that would relate to these big themes. If it's going to be something very recent, maybe themes of anti-imperialism, right? So I would look for those big themes. There, I think the most recent thing I've seen in the key concepts might be the mention of like Al Qaeda and 9/11. I don't know if there's anything even more recent. Usually we consider the last 20 years to be current events, so it is fair game. I mean, I can't predict whether or not it will or will not be on the test, but that's a good question. But it does go to the present technically. Do you need to know anything about Franco Spain? Military dictatorship, I guess, would be the main thing. Fascist state. I guess, yeah, we kind of leave off with Spain after the Spanish Civil War, but Franco rules up until like the mid 70s, I think. So that's what I would say is significant. That's what you need to know. Could you briefly state important ideas or important dates or ideas of Maoist communism? Sure. I will do my best to be brief with this. Mao Zedong starts the Communist Party in 1922, I want to say. You can check those dates. But anyways, 1920s, Communist Party starts shortly after, maybe 25, shortly after the nationalists start to crack down on the communists. Mao kind of gains fame. He leads the communists on their long march, kind of hiding in the mountains of China, kind of building support among the peasant class, right? Until we see basically the Sino-Japanese War break out as the Japanese invade. Of course, the communists fight against the Japanese as the nationalists do. You kind of see a break in action. But after the end of World War II, from 1945 to 1949, we see that civil war in China, and the Communist Party becoming victorious, forcing the Nationalist Party off the mainland to Taiwan. That occurs 1949, I want to say, right? So the Mao's government takes over then and is in charge of China from that point forward. I'm trying to get some dates on these. The main events you need to know: number one, the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward began in 1958, according to these notes. And it was a reorganization of land into peasant communes. Land was held by the state rather than peasant farmers. It was modeled on the collectivization found under Stalin's government in Russia. And those who did not allow the government to take over their land, or those who protested, were sent to re-education camps, or of course they were killed. So you can think of those as like Stalin's gulags or what have you. The Great Leap Forward failed massively. About 20 million Chinese starved to death in the resulting famines. In 1966, so this is about 8 years after the Great Leap Forward, Mao starts this cultural revolution, which tried to really push kind of the communist future of China. Basically, this is similar to, analogous to the purges that Stalin went through undertook in Russia. And so basically you had groups of like revolutionary students, seized like anybody who was seen to be anti-communist or anti-Maoist, and they were sent to the Chinese countryside for, once again, re-education. So those are the big things that you need to know about Mao. That said, beginning in the early 60s, the Soviet Union and China had some disagreements about their borders. They did border one another, and they had skirmishes over them. And they also tried to compete for influence around the world. So we see kind of a rift develop between Mao and the Soviet Union. So those are some big talking points for Mao and his version of communism. Remember that we have these different versions of communism, so to speak. The original vision of communism, Marxist visions of communism, is that the proletariat, the working classes, like the working industrial class in cities, would rise up and seize the means of production and establish this kind of more equal society. Lenin changes that. He says that that the proletariat might need help, right? That they need help to overthrow the ruling class, and then you can kind of turn things over to them. Mao believed that revolution did not come from the urban working class, but instead actually was a revolution of the peasantry, right? So he adapted it to his circumstances and where he could find support. And remember, China was a country of peasant farmers. So where are you going to find the people in need who want to see this change? In the countryside. In Marx's Europe during the middle of the Industrial Revolution, in Germany, in Britain, in France, in Belgium, you're going to find support in the struggling working class. And everything I just said. Daniel, nice job. Nailed it. All right, good. Glad. I can just turn to you guys to answer these questions. That would be even better. Can you briefly review, how did the Ottoman, Russian, and Manchu empires fall? Yes, Ottoman Empire. I had this in a review packet, so I'm just going to refer back to my notes. That way I can actually be brief rather than pretending to be brief and then going on like a long diatribe about what happens across the board. Of course, now you have to listen to me shuffle papers. My deepest apologies, as that is probably one of the most annoying sounds that you might ever hear. Although I don't think I have the actual paper that says it. So I'll just remember it. A variety of internal and external factors is how the key concepts word it. Basically, what we see is, found it. The Qing Empire is weakening. We see that in the last time period. If you remember in the late 1800s, there was these like imperialist incursions into the country and fights back against imperialism. We had the Dowager Cixi, Cixi is how you spell that. She basically like tacitly approved revolution against or fights like in the Boxer Rebellion, for example, against these like the British and the French incursions in the country. And when those rebellions are put down, she has to basically say, oh crap, like shouldn't have done that. But the government continues to weaken. There's economic stagnation in the Qing Empire. The self-strengthening movement that we saw in the second half of the 19th century was a failure. So just general political instability leads to the rise of these nationalists, or this nationalist party that eventually takes over, and the Qing Empire kind of crumbles. The nationalists kind of rise up and establish the Republic of China. So if we think about internal regions, mostly economic stagnation, general discontent in China, failed reforms. External reasons, you might see those kind of European imperial pressures continually kind of chipping away at the Qing Empire. The Ottoman Empire was also weakening. Remember, it had been considered the sick man of Europe for a while because it had been losing control of its hold in southeastern Europe. The Greeks had gained their independence. Other countries, Serbia had gained its independence. Austria-Hungary had kind of pushed back against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans needed help from Britain and France to win the Crimean War. Of course, that caused a whole set of things over in Russia. But ultimately, the Ottoman Empire's reason for collapse is their loss in World War I. That forces them to break up completely. The British had supported the Saudis in what is now Saudi Arabia. They had basically told them they could be independent if they led this insurrection. The British and the French established mandates throughout Transjordan, which basically is Jordan and Syria, or Jordan and Palestine. They established mandate in Syria, in Iraq. So they kind of carve up that Ottoman Empire in their favor. But the Ottoman Empire had been weakening internally because it's just very difficult to govern a multinational empire. All right. And then externally is that military defeat in World War I. So they become the state of Turkey. Lastly, the Russian Empire, we see political and social discontent within the country. For a long time, Russia had a problem with not providing for the poorest peasants, right? And that had been since the times of serfdom. I was actually listening to a podcast about this yesterday morning. It's called 15-Minute History. The University of Texas puts it on. The first episode is about this idea of why this revolution occurs, but it goes through some of those internal political, the internal discontent within the country. For example, there were, as far back as the 19th century, kind of enlightened middle-class people who pushed for reform in Russia, but really the upper class, the czarists, the czar and his supporters weren't keen on making those changes. And the disconnect between the czar and his people really becomes super evident in World War I as he sends people to the front lines completely unprepared for war, and people and also a war that they're getting their butts kicked in, by the way. And so the czar does not pull out of this war, and what results is basically a revolution, the first part of a two-part revolution that overthrows the government, that removes the czar from power. But the provisional government that's set in place does not acquiesce to people's demands either. They do not end the involvement in World War I. And so what happens is the Bolsheviks kind of complete the second part of this revolution, overthrowing the provisional government, killing the czar and their family to make sure they do not come back to power after the war, and establishing the Soviet Union. Once in power, Vladimir Lenin, who leads this Russian Revolution, he signs an agreement with Germany to get out of the war, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which isn't that great of a deal for Russia. The Soviet Union has to give up a large portion of its land. It's something like a quarter of its population lived in the land that it gave up. And of course, when we see the rise of Stalin and we see the push to World War II, one thing the Soviet Union wants to do is take advantage of that war to take more land. In fact, the treaty, the non-aggression pact signed between Stalin and Hitler, agreed to divide up Poland between the two countries. So as Germany invaded Poland, kicking off World War II, the Soviets could come in and take over kind of the Russian, what they saw as their Russian half that they had previously controlled. Of course, we know how that goes. Hitler goes back on his agreement and attacks the Soviet Union directly. It works out pretty well for the Soviet Union in terms of reestablishing control over large areas of land, and then establishing their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Again, I went way too far into that. Why does the Russian Empire collapse? Political and social discontent within the country, the inability of the government to respond to the needs of the people, and external reason, the devastation of World War I. Those two things lead to the double revolution, ultimately with the Bolsheviks rising to power. All right. are we doing a DBQ or an SAQ on the exam tomorrow? Well, you're not going to have a DBQ tomorrow because tomorrow is a multiple choice test, but you will have a take-home DBQ. SAQ, I have to look and double check to see if I can fit that in tomorrow. We may just do some practice SAQs this week when you come into class instead. But if I can fit it in the test tomorrow, you will have one. Danielle, will we need to know all the alliances and new organizations during this time period? Warsaw Pact, NATO, NAFTA, World Bank, etc. So you do need to know examples of them, but keep in mind that there's some of these are military alliances, some of these are new international organizations developed kind of with a worldwide, with the entire world in mind. Some of them spin-offs of the United Nations to support newly independent countries. World Bank would be an example of that. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact would be our examples of military alliances. And then NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that would be an example of a trade organization that promoted the ideals of free market economics. And there are some others, ASEAN or ASEAN or ASEAN. It's ASEAN. Still don't know how to say it, by the way. So a trade organization of Southeast Asian nations. Modern example would be what could turn into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Maybe, maybe not. Mercosur in South America, the European Economic Community, or EU in Europe. So what do you need to know about these? It's not going to be a test that says, do you know what this acronym means? It hopefully will not be tricky in trying to say NATO when it means NAFTA, anything like that. But if you see something about one of these terms, you need to be able to kind of generally connect it. Is this a military alliance? Is it a trade agreement? Is it an international organization pushing for world peace or for greater trade freedom? Something along those lines. But hopefully the context of the readings and the questions will help you figure that out. Certainly, if you were writing, it'd be good to use those as examples. All right, we're going to go for maybe 5 more minutes, maybe a few more questions. I got 2 more left on here, but if you have any more, maybe 1 or 2 after that. Ose asks, will we need to know anything about the new technologies of the Roaring '20s? I mean, the car, that's pretty much it, I'd say. Automobile, maybe the increased use of the telephone and radio. But the Roaring '20s is, in terms of roaring, is more of an American idea. So you'll learn much more about that in AP US history. It's not really an AP world idea. Communications and transportation technology does come up in the key concepts, of course. We talked about it the other day. It helped reduce geographical distance, but not necessarily something we go into too much depth in, especially in relation to the United States. We minimize kind of the role, or minimize our discussion of U.S. politics in this class for sake of understanding kind of the role of the U.S. in world events. Gus, can you quickly go over the fall of the USSR and how it affected global relations and U.S.-Russian relations? Excuse me. Yes. So the Soviet Union falls for a number of reasons, but the key concepts ask you to kind of think about 3 of these reasons. The first being that the United States, especially beginning with the Reagan presidency, basically undertakes a goal of outspending the Soviets. We know that they're reaching some tough economic times, and we guess that our growing economy, we can simply outspend them. Ronald Reagan, of course, starts the Star Wars program, which is just space lasers, idea of shooting down missiles. Never comes to fruition, but it's kind of scary for the Soviet Union, thinking the United States could do that. And the United States starts producing some of the best technology in the world at this time. And so that spending forces the Soviet Union to also ratchet up their spending, except that communist economies, as we get into the 80s, are faltering. They are becoming very stagnant. We're entering a world where free trade, kind of Western style free market economics is taking off, and these communist countries are really not seeing those same gains. So the weakening of these communist countries' economies forces them to make some changes. We see this under the regime of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. Basically, the policy of glasnost or openness, where we see the Soviet Union start to introduce some level of free market economics, allowing for greater freedoms within the Eastern Bloc countries, greater connections between East and West. What this does, though, by allowing some of these kind of consumer goods from the West into the Eastern Bloc countries, is it shows them like the type of lives people in the Western world are living, and the comforts that they have, and what they're able to enjoy, right? And so we see kind of an increase in pro-democratic demonstrations in these countries. Eventually, some of which, like we see in Germany, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of East and West Germany into a single Germany again. The other thing that we see is the Soviets' involvement in Afghanistan becomes a money pit. So that's actually named in the key concepts. And it's certainly part of kind of economic troubles, but the Soviet Union gets bogged down in a long war in Afghanistan, which pretty much bankrupts the country, and shows the world that maybe this country that everybody assumed on the face of things was extremely strong, maybe isn't quite as put together as it seems. And eventually, the Soviet Union allows its member states, basically ever since it had formed, the member states could vote to leave the Soviet Union. That's basically what happens, and the Soviet Union dissolves and Ukraine gains independence. Russia, shrinks down to Russia. The Low Country, or the Baltic states, become independent. And so we see the country break apart. The big bad superpower falls. Now, what does that mean for today? Well, the Soviet Union, or Russia, I think, went through some years where people assumed that they had weakened, but certainly under Vladimir Putin, he has gained a lot of support in Russia because of his willingness to still stand up to the West. Maybe that hadn't been seen so much under Boris Yeltsin, but instead, Stalin has put his foot down in a lot of areas, and kind of, in a way, kind of modeling himself maybe on Stalin, silenced some of his critics, and really tried to reestablish Russia in that role of, you have to worry about us now. Now, for anybody who works for Putin who might be watching this video, that's my viewpoint. Please don't come after me. That'd be thanks. So that's kind of the best I can do on that situation, or on that. I'm not an expert in U.S.-Russian relations. I watch the news, so that's probably the best I can do anyways on that. That's a really good question, Gus, and I wish I could answer it better than I did. Last question posted here, so we'll call it the last one for the night. Are the majority of the questions on the test going to be prompt-based? That's the idea. Stimulus-based questions. Stimulus-based multiple choice questions, SBMCs. That's what we hope to get you ready for. That's what the AP exam is in its entirety. So the majority of the questions on test tomorrow should be in that format. To be honest, I have to look back at the test to double check, but you'll have a minute per question, and they should be in that format. All right, guys, that was about an hour because I started a little after 7:45. Oh, please no Russian. I don't know what that means. I don't know if your computer's been hacked. So hopefully that's not something bad. I hope y'all have a good night. Get some sleep tonight. We got a big week this week. I think it's a 5-day week for the first time in a while. So, oh no, it's not. It's a 4-day week. But on Friday, I will see you for your practice exam. So, for you, I guess it is, and for me, it's a 5-day week. So we'll need our rest as we finish things up. Hope you have a good night, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.